and welcome. Or in this case, hello, good evening, and Wenger. Yes, the subject of today's Libero podcast will be Le Prof, Arsene Wenger. We come to praise, not always to bury him, but his story is of one of the greatest and most influential managers in football history, with someone who's had quite an interesting afterlife beyond the management game. Anyway, we're just first to say, this is our 50th edition of Libero, and so we're raising our bat to the pavilion to warm applause. Well, hopefully. Do you know what? If you want to add to that acclaim, you can like and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Comments especially welcome. Our plan is to go for the Daddy 100 at the very least and beyond. Now, using that cricketing analogy has caused Miguel a bit of confusion here. That's Miguel Delany, of course, of The Independent. Tariq Panja of the New York Times is more of a man of the willow and leather. I'm John Brewin, a man of denim and leather. We are speaking, actually, just after recording the Football Cliches quiz. Myself, Jack and Jonathan, we had a fun time, a great couple of hours. And we fought very hard to uphold the honour of the Libero podcast. Right then, Arsene Wenger, a man who probably requires little introduction, despite the end of his Arsenal career coming over 7 years ago. Guess who was handed the Guardian live blog that day? It was one of those days, and as he himself said afterwards, it almost felt like his celestial being had left the building, like he died and got to see how his obituary would be. As it turns out, he wasn't done with football at all, and he's remained a person of importance and influence ever since, really, of which a bit more later. But for starters, chaps, I'm going to ask you to share a personal memory of Wenger. Miguel, I think you've interviewed him, haven't you? But anything come to mind?
So I did FIFA Towers with him 2 years ago. Exactly 2 years. It was actually this day. And you know, it's amazing with Wenger. Like, I mean, for all the kind of, like, he was obviously talking about his new role as like the director of global development of FIFA, which we'll obviously get into later. But for all the perceptions you have of him, for all the kind of the kind of predetermined opinions or what you know from covering him. The one thing with Wenger is once you start to sit down with him and just kind of the insights start spooling out. I mean, he is one of the game's great speakers and thinkers in that sense. And who was also actually, it's probably a little bit underappreciated, I think, how much of a laugh he is. Like he, especially once the cameras were off, to be fair, and he could speak a bit more freely, but he would willingly have a joke. I mean, this did get a bit, like his Friday briefings, they used to get a lot more tense towards the end, and they went from kind of like these 25-minute open sessions to like 7 minutes. And he would always come in 50 minutes late. I don't know if that was to piss us off, probably in some ways. But the thing was about him is, and it was like this when I spoke to him in September, once he started speaking, he couldn't stop himself, really, and he used to love to get into it. Like, even it's incredible because he was speaking about strikers a little bit, and that in among other subjects, like I suppose how football isn't producing enough good players given the number of people who play it because of resources, all of this. How kind of, you know, one of his goals is to try and recreate park football and academies. But it's amazing, like he was talking about how you develop strikers, and it's amazing how, like, 11 years on, I remember he was talking about, before one of the Liverpool games, he was talking about Luis Suarez, and he made some comment that actually, anytime I'm writing about forwards or something like that, that's something we discussed in Libero, I always go back to it because it was just his insight. He was talking about how South American football is still one of the few places that produces actual strikers because the nature of their development means there's still a kind of an aggressive element to the strikers against the centre halves, which actually just starts to hone players in a way European academies had forgotten. And it's something that you'd still refer back to years later. And obviously he was actually still thinking about. But yeah, he was, it's and actually funny, in anticipation of the pod today, I was speaking to someone who has been at Arsenal throughout that period. And they were talking about in the year after Wenger left, to be fair, this began to change once Arteta came in and try to get Arsenal back on track to what he felt they should be. He said that there was an immediate kind of loss of warmth of Wenger for all the flaws to the end, and maybe it was because it was kind of like the club was built up to this father figure. There was a warmth around Arsenal. You did feel it when you went up to the training ground, if not necessarily in some of the more tense days.
I was going to say, actually, I mean, he had this image, didn't he, of this guy that was devoted only to football and would spend every hour watching videotapes of, French third division stuff. But actually, when you speak to those people that know him a bit more closely, he's a bit more of a bon vivant, a bit more of a laugh, great company, has enjoyed life. Tariq, share your personal experience of the great man.
Yeah, again, it was a bit more recent as well. I mean, the thing with him is like he's got that haughty reputation, like we said, Le Prof, and kind of above it all. But among all these kind of elite football types, whether it's players or these great managers or people queue up to get their signatures for example, autograph hunters, this guy comes across completely normal, and I think that is huge credit to him as a person, because given what football is today and just being associated, I'm sure like Miguel Delany gets chased through airports for people trying to talk to him. So, Arsene Wenger. So
I hope so.
I was in Zurich recently. I think not that recent, a couple of years ago. So he's got this new job. Miguel's described it there at FIFA, and where this man just goes to work every day. This sounds a bit weird, but he is an employee. It's quite weird to think of Arsene Wenger as an employee of a company, and that's what he does. So, I was there with Graham Dunbar, I think, from the AP, and we need somewhere to go to lunch. The only place near FIFA is this pizzeria, Italian restaurant. You go there, and there's nothing fancy about this place. And there's a bloke having lunch there with his colleagues. It's Arsene Wenger and this guy from Belgium, Mertens, who they do this kind of football development work for FIFA with. We've obviously seen each other over the years. Hi, how you doing? Very polite, very nice, happy to talk to us. There wasn't this, often with journalists, I don't know, Miguel, John, you find it, there's certain characters in football. They'll be like, they'll see you coming through the door. The enemy is here. These awful people are here. But this guy, there's just something completely normal about Wenger, given that he's had this pretty abnormal life. And we're going to get into this in a while here. And I think there's a human side of him that is often overlooked.
Yeah. On that, he does just love to talk football, no matter who it's with. And that sounds like Tariq's point there about just going to work. It sounds like such an obvious thing, but it's not, because especially people that have been in his position, even from some journalists talk about when you have the wedding chat, when you sat at a wedding and you tell someone what you do, and they basically say things like, "Oh, Arsenal want to walk the ball into the net." I mean, that's a bit of an old reference now. But I suppose a certain kind of haughtiness come in where, someone is talking about football from a different level of understanding. Now, Wenger is obviously infinitely above us, or above anyone in the street. And yet the sense you get of him is that once he starts talking about football, he loves to get into it. And I love this kind of, how it's played, the joy of it, like what he's seeing in the game. And hence, it was always the case, those Friday briefings, once he started, you couldn't stop him. And it was always a funny, it was almost like beforehand, as if maybe it had been agreed that the press officer would step in at a certain point and we'll just end it there. And but by the time he got into it, it would be said, right, okay, one more, then we'll go. And Wenger would almost look up and say, well, I'm happy to keep going.
Yeah. My personal memory is from a press conference, which was a post-match press conference in the more stormy years. Now, a gentleman of the press of that time was Steve Howard of The Sun, a classic Fleet Street thunderer. He's a good old laugher, Steve. He never did much TV because he liked to keep himself, just behind a print. But in press conferences, he could be a fairly fearsome old customer. And I was chatting to Steve outside the press room, and at Arsenal, they have the press room is in this sort of almost cinema room, and you have to go in from the press room, and they call you in, Arsene Wenger. So me and Steve were chatting, and suddenly realised we were late. and we walk straight in, and Wenger's there, and we're sort of stood at right angles against the door, and Steve just goes to him, "Wasn't very good, was it?" And just like straight out to Wenger. And the look that Wenger gave Steve Howard and me for being next to Steve Howard, just like, is this your friend? Like, is this how you speak? Just this stare of just, and this is the thing, because, having been to the briefings where Wenger's relaxed, there was a very different side at times, wasn't there, when he was on the defensive, because he would defend himself, and he wasn't very good also at hiding his great defeats. And another memory briefly is the Birmingham City League Cup final, lost by that horrific error by goalkeeper Koscielny. Koscielny and Szczesny, isn't it? Make that mistake. And just after the game, he barely said anything, but he just said of the players, they are destroyed. And he was not very quotable manager, great in a press conference, even when it was brief. And he would defend himself, and he got a lot of stick. And the thing is, he was able to defend himself because he was an urbane man. And speak to Manchester United fans, and I would always say, "Oh, Arsene Wenger is the best manager to listen to," and they'd be like, "But he's Wenger." But no, he was an urbane, intelligent guy who had a lot to say, even in his lowest points. But let's go back to the start of Arsene Wenger's time. He's from Strasbourg. He's an Alsatian. And he's so... I was researching this for a piece I did the other day, but he was so embedded in the region that his first language was actually Low Alemannic German rather than French. And when Strasbourg won their only title back in 1979, Wenger was already on the road to becoming a coach. He was on the team, but didn't play too much in that time. A team that included Ramon Domenech, who an interesting French coach, of which I'm sure we could do a four-parter. And then the Wenger family were an automobile spare parts business. They owned a bistro. But I suppose the time that I first heard of Arsene Wenger, well, not actually knowing who Arsene Wenger was the Monaco team, late 80s, early 90s. At the time, a good friend of mine was actually from a Monegasque family. He lived in Cheshire. And he would come and tell us of this great team, the one that Glenn Hoddle played in. Now, Glenn Hoddle at the time, you'd hear this on State and Greaves or whatever. Like, oh, Glenn is over in France. And finally, this idea of setting the boy free. He's playing this great football. He's playing football much beyond even his Spurs days. And Mark Hateley has developed these dimensions to his game. But my friend told me of George Weah. Right? They've got a Liberian player called George Weah. He's absolutely brilliant. And Wenger, I think, is one of the first managers really to push African footballers to the fore. I mean, French football and African football has always had that link since the 50s or whatever. But in Premier League terms, one of them to first trust them, bring African players, because maybe less enlightened managers didn't have that same belief in them. And so George Weah I think George Weah, when he won the World Player of the Year, he dedicated that award to Wenger, didn't he?
I mean, his career has almost maybe come full circle in that way, because, like, to be fair, whatever you think about his being at FIFA now, and we will get into that, the job is obviously about actually kind of raising the level of global football, having faith in global football, not being so anchored to kind of the Western European economy, and from that's exactly what he showed there. And like, I think one of the things with Wenger as well, obviously, and this was the case, as you say, in France, with his willingness to start to trusting players from Africa, and obviously some of the kind of the kind of francophone world as well, and then at Arsenal, at a time when the Premier League was still, you would say, very British flavoured. Obviously, he was willing to kind of really use his contacts in the French market. There was an element, I suppose, people would call it first mover advantage. Now, first mover advantage sounds a bit dismissive, as because if you just did something that everyone else is about to, but it's not dismissive. It's actually, I would say, it's a compliment, because it's about actually having the insight and the trust to do it. Exactly as you say, John, that it's someone who was willing to have faith when maybe others were a bit more reserved, a bit more conservative. and he reaped the rewards for it. And it wasn't the only aspect of his career at that point where he was willing to be proactive, because obviously that was, of course, the kind of the thrust of his football as well.
I wonder. He seemed open-minded in an era that wasn't as open-minded as we are. Like all of what we're going to talk about might seem really normal to a very young football fan today. It was extremely enlightening at that time because we hadn't really seen anything like it. And the moment he kind of arrived at this perfect moment, I think, for England and for Britain as well. Middle of the 90s, culturally, the country starts opening up. Then the Premier League at that point was this really exciting thing from the players' point. The Premier League starts in 92. Wenger comes in 96. In between, you have a certain openness to talent that had arrived. So if you think just before Wenger came, the players that were here, there was Ruud Gullit was here already. It was Zola, Ravanelli was here. So on the playing side, we got this kind of sudden feel of exotic football on our shores finally, but we didn't have these coaches. Wenger, there was Dr. Joseph Englosh, maybe people might remember at Aston Villa, but really didn't leave any mark. And then this guy arrives, because I was going through the list of managers who were here when Wenger arrived. So this was the Premier League from a coach's standpoint, and you got Brian Little at Aston Villa, Blackburn with Ray Harford. Ruud Gullit had just been made player manager at Chelsea, so you have this. Big Ron, Coventry City, some Jim Smith at Derby, Joe Royle, George Graham. So you get that sense of what we're talking about when he comes here. But I also think he was underrated in a way because the world was different. If you even think about the internet, it's quite new. The idea of globalization and knowing stuff. You might get 2 minutes on Saint and Greavesy, but this guy was 7 or 8 years as the coach of Monaco, which was under him one of the best teams in France, playing this very, very attractive and quite winning football.
Yeah.
But he was in a league that was really, really competitive. If you think about the Premier League now with Big Fours and Big Fives and Big Six, the French league had Marseille, PSG, Bordeaux, and Monaco,
and Montpellier as well, Valderrama.
Look, so Montpellier with Carlos Valderrama, and you had this situation where Wenger, and we'll get to this, where he had opponents that might have had certain advantages that other teams didn't have, with Marseille, who were then caught cheating. People have said his Monaco team would have won a lot more had Marseille not had that Bird and Tappy era. And then the other thing, when he arrived, everyone was like, who's this guy coming from Japan? You're like, if you think about it now, it was so parochial, some of this thinking, because this guy turned down Bayern Munich a couple of years earlier. Giovanni Trapattoni goes over there. This was a huge coup for
it was David Dean, wasn't it? Yeah, and actually I was going to just flip back to that Monaco Marseille thing. Wenger, of course, is maybe 10 years later, but when the money started to come in from Chelsea, from Manchester City, he was the guy the guy saying financial doping was the phrase he came up with, wasn't it? But he talks in 2006 about the Bernard Tapie Marseille thing. There's a quote here. I wanted to warn people, make it public, but I couldn't prove anything definitively. At that time, corruption and doping were big things, and there was nothing worse than knowing the cards were stacked against us from the beginning. Now,
well, that was the whole reason he went to Japan, wasn't it? Because he was basically disillusioned with.
Well, I think the funny thing, from what I understand, that the Bayern offer rather soured things with Monaco, and things started to go a bit downhill there. But yeah, I mean. Don Fifield, a friend of ours, wrote a piece on him for the Observer 10 years ago or so, talking about Wenger as a Monaco manager. There would be 45-minute tactical lectures before each game outlining opponents' strengths and weaknesses, a reliance on data collection on a program called Top Scorer, a precursor to Pro Zone. Every player's decision on the pitch was analysed. such statistical analysis are a matter of course now. But in the late 80s, it was something of an innovation. I mean, the thing is, this is a very modern coach. And the weird thing is that about Wenger is that towards the end of his career, he's regarded as outdated, which is quite sad considering what a pioneer he is. Miguel.
But on that as well, because obviously Tariq's absolutely right in terms of kind of the international dimension and how he really kind of shifted that. But that, I think that is also more than just about kind of the bare facts of nationality and even outlook. Like some of it was actually psychological. So I remember Ian Wright telling me, sorry, name drop there, but he was saying like that one of the biggest things he noticed with Wenger was, so he'd gone to Arsenal under George Graham, and he loves George Graham still, a kind of essentially a father figure to him. But Graham is obviously from a certain school of especially in terms of like the whole classic school of hard knocks. After he had Bruce Rioch, who he had a difficult relationship with, and it was all about, I suppose, the most generous way you could put it was tough love, and kind of like really kind of grinding players to drive more out of them. Whereas suddenly, for the first time in his Arsenal career, in that sense, he had Wenger coming in, and Wenger, like, one of the first things he said to him was just trust yourself. I want express yourself, and he suddenly, even the simple words just caused this kind of change in his outlook. And of course, like we did see another dimension through in Ian Wright through those seasons. I suppose there was still an element of the old school about Wenger, which is how he got into so much of it with Ferguson. I did hear shortly after he bought Giroud. Obviously, Giroud was a good player, good striker, if not top class. And there was one where Wenger was watching him at training once, and he called him over. One thing, Olivier, if you ever watch videos of the top strikers, you ever notice what does Thierry do when he places it? Yeah, you get that, don't you? Oh yeah, yes, boss. Yeah. So why do you try and finish like a fucking donkey?
Okay, so that could be from a Brian Clough or something, couldn't it? Yeah. Anyway, we should mention actually that Wenger. I mean, I think Rory said this. There was this idea that Wenger invented broccoli for footballers to eat. Because when he went to Japan, one of the things he noticed is that most of the people there were thin. I mean, he's very thin himself, of course, but he noticed that everyone was thin, and people have different metabolisms and all that, and it's because the diet was steamed veg, lean fish, lean meat, and he brought that to football. I mean, at the time, I remember stories of like Steve Bruce wanting a suet pudding before running out on a pitch, and Tony Adams was sort of, like steak and chips and stuff like that, and then suddenly, I mean, I don't think nutrition was quite as bad as it is portrayed. It wasn't like school dinners and McCain oven chips and stuff like that, but it was. He brought that change, and the thing is, he brought that change to other clubs as well. Alex Ferguson is watching, up the road, thinking, how come they are suddenly so fit? Because that first 97, 98 Arsenal team was brutishly strong, as well as very, very skillful, wasn't it? And he brought not only a flair to the football, but a muscle as well was part of that team. And I suppose we have to go at this point to that big rivalry with Manchester United and Ferguson, which possibly still one of the defining storylines of the entire Premier League era, wasn't it? Those are the games that when people are thinking that stuff's not going great, that the Premier League's boring, they look back to those tussles at Highbury and at Old Trafford and battles of buffets and so on. And when that was about the time that I came into the trade, and what I remember was that in the old days when the Friday night into Saturday newspapers were big sellers and everyone needed a big back page lead, it basically alternated between Ferguson and Wenger, almost talking about each other. I think the Wenger quote was, "Do not mention that man," or "I do not want to talk about that man."
He was still called, even though they get on now. He apparently still calls him Ferguson.
Ferguson, yeah, and I think it was a pun you made. I should give it away, Tariq. Is that you knew that the Wenger's powers were failing a little bit once Ferguson started being nice about him towards the end, and but that rivalry was so white hot. And when Manchester United won the treble in 1999. I remember that they spoke to a lot of the players, like, what was the best team you faced all season? Almost every one of them said Arsenal. You know, that was the team they had to surpass. And they took United to those levels, but they were a brilliant team themselves. They were fantastic.
Leagues need rivalries.
Yes.
Well, and teams need rivalries. And we've seen it recently with Manchester City and Liverpool getting to this 100 point. But that enmity, maybe it might be rose tinted, but that enmity between those Arsenal and United teams, those early Wenger years, up until it started to go wrong, and those Fergie teams, I don't think we've seen anything quite like that. The world's changed a little bit. The way newspapers work, the way these comments were they were just so. It was acid tongued, wasn't it? It was amazing, and then it sets up.
Not bad, like, to be fair, didn't it?
It was undignified quite a lot of the time.
And then it set up those games, and then what happened in the intensity of those games, football. And you guys have talked about the evolution of the game itself and tactics and how teams are set up, but the level of intensity in those football matches between Arsenal and Manchester United in that period was just something that was extremely powerful for the Premier League as a brand. It grew through this stuff, and there's iconic moments. And I was thinking about these as we were preparing for this, and obviously you've got a few. I mean, I'll say a couple, and maybe you guys will. For me, there's the Vieira and Roy Keane in the tunnel at Highbury before the game.
In 2005, yeah.
Keane's caught on was it the hot mic? Everyone says he's a nice guy and all of this, and he's picking on Gary Neville or whatever he said there. And then the other one, of course, is 2003. Martin Keown and Ruud van Nistelrooy after that penalty, and really, it was too much. Football maybe shouldn't go to places like that, but it was an iconic moment, and it just spoke to the intensity of those games.
The thing about that, even the Keown one, the Keown Van Nistelrooy one, that came out of what for me was probably the best game of the entire rivalry, bar the '99 semi-final, which was a 2-2 at Highbury in the 2002-2003 run-in. I think that was like when it was at its kind of peak, and they were really going for it in terms of the title race. The game itself came at a good time in the season. I think it was around April. It was a brilliant match.
Well, yeah, Van Nistelrooy's goal. I think there's a Thierry Henry scores a goal, and then there's a Sol Campbell sending off for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. There's an elbow there. Yeah, I was at the 2003 game. I went to the sequence of those at Old Trafford, and the atmosphere of those games, even though because you can kick off at 12:30, and 12:30 games, as we all know, being a bit somber atmosphere. Wow, just unbelievable. The one thing is that I suppose about the players and the managers going at it is that the atmosphere outside the ground was a bit tasty as well. It was after that.
Didn't you see the Old Trafford shouter on a train once? The famous guy who scored after the over.
Once I was on. He was the guy they said. Well, I was at that game as well. The Mark Overmars goal, and there's a guy with a sort of longish hair and a
curly black hair, wasn't it?
Curly black hair and a leather jacket, and he came on all the videos, and thanks to the genius of Virgin Rail at the time, I booked on a train to go to Macclesfield that somehow took me off. I had to change at Stafford. Classic. Thanks very much for that. It's a direct train normally. Anyway, so I'm on this train, and it's full of Arsenal fans going to Liverpool because they're playing at Liverpool the next morning. And I sat down and I looked at this guy and I said, "Aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am that guy who cheered the goal." And his hair was cut short, but it was obviously him, and he was with a load of Arsenal fans. But yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Just on the emotion as well. I mean, there's that good one. Hugh McIlvanney once wrote that. He made them in 03-04 when obviously Arsenal were invincible in the league. He made the mistake of saying to Ferguson, Arsenal, you have to say they've been irresistible this season, haven't you? And Fergie's response was, not against Manchester United. Because they didn't beat United that season.
Well, I mean, if we talk about Wenger, he would make these sweeping pronouncements, wasn't he? And I think he said the season before, he said, "I think we can go unbeaten."
Wasn't that?
And then the season after, he said, "I think we can go unbeaten." And then the following season, they did go unbeaten. And that achievement was absolutely amazing. I mean, people try and do it. Oh, he drew so many games. I'm sorry, going unbeaten a whole season, incredible achievement.
It's absolutely huge, and it speaks to like the comments you said about him saying that I think we can do this. I think he's talking to his players. Something Patrick Vieira has said. He gave his players this immense amount of confidence that they can be better than they are. This level of self-belief that when they go on the pitch, express yourself, be free, and you are going to be better than your opponents. And often in that period that they were. This is a facet of his, I guess, communication skills and getting into those players. But the other thing I thought of smart from Wenger as well in those early days. Yes, he's come with these new fangled ideas for English football, if you want, but he did keep a lot of English players in that team, players steeped in that. He didn't like sweep everybody out. He improved those players who were also extremely experienced. He lengthened careers as well as muscles, probably. I mean, look, someone said he's introduced. I mean, it just sounds so weird, doesn't it? He introduced stretching like to these players, but it's this stuff in the round. Yes, he's got these new ideas, but he knew what to keep as well, and also the staff around him. It was very English. Pat Rice, Arsenal legend, he kept people around from Arsenal, and then the release of this for me, another iconic moment, if you want, that speaks to Wenger's ability to change Arsenal from what they were to what they were to become, was in that final game against Everton at Highbury. You will all remember that Tony Adams scores this goal and has that celebration, sun-dappled afternoon. It was like this perfect image. But if you think how that move progressed, it's gnarly 35-year-old Steve Bold going through midfield and playing this sort of inch-perfect lob. That wouldn't have been Steve Bold doing that in the pub.
Well, the commentary on that, I think the local radio commentary was about Jonathan Pearce, and I think the commentary was he always scores. Great stuff from JP there. So Wenger, the glory years, and they were glorious years, weren't they? They really were. And you know, him and Ferguson locked together. But as we'll get to in part 2, there was a downfall and there was an afterlife. See you after the break. Welcome again to part 2 of episode 50 of Libero. Miguel and Tariq are still with me. We are still talking about Arsene Wenger. But yes, things began to change for Arsene Wenger, didn't they? And the two things that come to mind that sunk the dream. 1, the Emirates Stadium itself. 2, Chelsea, and later Manchester City. And Tariq, do you want to talk about the finances, the business aspects of that?
Yeah, so obviously moving from Highbury to Emirates was a dream of the board there as well. And in Arsene Wenger, they had someone who, I guess, shared that vision of moving into this new arena. And the cost to Arsenal was considerable. This was a huge undertaking, and it meant that initially, at least, they had to cut their cloth accordingly and couldn't keep up. I would say in the early years, given the costs associated with building the Emirates Stadium, and then they had to. I think they sold Highbury, which is now a development for apartments that are quite expensive, and I think Arsenal would benefit from that as well. But there was a period that was quite lean. However, I've been kind of thinking about this and looking at the numbers as well. It wasn't that long. It didn't need to be as long as it was, this lean spell where Arsenal were not spending money. And I think there's this key moment around 2010 to 2012. Arsenal have north of £100 million. This might sound really like like pocket change when we'd seen players, Alexander Isak moved last week for 125 million, but they had between 100 and 200 million pounds banked in their on their balance sheet. This is money they could spend, and they didn't spend it, and they were like keeping their powder dry. Meanwhile, Chelsea are doing what they're doing under Abramovich, who arrives in 2005. Manchester United, despite the Glazers, are keeping their performance levels up. Right, they were spending when they need to spend, and at the top of the league. Arsenal, for some reason, I think, allowed themselves to disappear into this idea of we need to establish ourselves at the Emirates, and just disappeared from the competition. The reason I say this, money loses its value over time if certain conditions change. And in the Premier League, they really did. So the Premier League TV deal up until 2012 was 1.6 billion, big number. And then suddenly, from 2012 from 2013 to 16, that goes up to 5.1 billion. So five-fold increase. And if Arsenal had spent that money that they had, even if they had 150 million, the most expensive transfer, sadly for Arsenal fans, in the 2012 season was Robin van Persie, a player who's basically said, I'm not going to win anything here, going to your deadly rival Manchester United for £24 million and winning and getting the championship he wanted. Arsenal, I think, could have bought 4 world-class players in that, if they wanted to, in that period, to supplement their team and to start competing again. And they didn't do it. And for the life of me, I've not heard a reasonable argument now for why they didn't do this.
One of the phrases that was said around the time was actually a self-defeating purism. And that often applied to a lot of Wenger, actually, right down to the structure of his team. In fact, do you remember, like, there was, especially in away games, there's a big debate about how he just needs to adapt in away games. And like Ferguson actually talks openly about this in his book, in his second book, the one he did with Paul Hayward, where, like, I think he literally used the word, or used the words like, we found Arsene always had a way of playing. So if you wanted to beat him, all he did was basically sit deep, get aggressive, and hit them on the break. And there were so many United Arsenal games that actually became identical in that way. I think eventually, late on, Wenger adopted. He got that one win at Manchester City with Coquelin in the centre of midfield. But yeah, again, it was like he generally just couldn't bring himself. And I wonder, is that the same with the spending? All the more so because the point in the stadium, I think what's so key there is, I mean, Arsenal 04, and obviously the stadium's already been built at this point, but we're talking about 01 up through to 04, become, like Manchester United, this international dimension club. And really, if you would have one criticism of peak Wenger, he should have won that European trophy. Arguably should have retained the title as well, but he was up against United, so fair enough. And 04 should have been when they won it. And of course, it's quite symbolic and significant that they lost it in Abramovich's first season at Chelsea. But essentially, the big issue there was the stadium was planned and signed off in a world where those are the parameters of football. TV was big, but it still wasn't transformatively big. It was getting to that level, but not yet. So obviously, like, you could see the parameters of the games. It was along geographical boundaries as regards TV markets, and it was your stadium and people that you get into your stadium. And by the time they eventually played our first game in the stadium, the parameters have been exploded. The internet and Wi-Fi is here, and I know it sounds such an obvious thing, but like, this is the way Real Madrid were looking. They were looking in terms of like global fan base, and Florentino Perez talking about how international telecommunications actually helps us. And of course, you have money, not just money, but immense money from outside. First from Abramovich, and like what you're saying there, Tariq, about money changing over time. Wenger's barren years, you'd say, traversed two biggest inflationary events in football, which are Abramovich taking over Chelsea, and that was 2003, of course. Okay, the start of trouble. Well, when they really started spending and having an effect, Chelsea, like that's a huge inflationary moment for football. And then, of course, Abu Dhabi or Sheikh Mansour taking over Manchester City.
Yeah, and okay, the idea that Arsenal could have won more over the glory years. I mean, you think of Wayne Bridges' goal, don't you? You think of
they should have won the 04 Champions League.
Yeah,
the way the season ended, and
you think of William Gallas. You think of William Gallas, like, sat down at Birmingham City, just like this is done in 2008. I mean, that's a bit later, but also Paris 2006. I mean, that was the one that got away, and and it felt like the downside was there. And then, talking from a business aspect as well, Tariq, it was an annual event, obviously, the annual general meeting, because fans at the time would have sort of minor shares, wouldn't they, in the club, and you'd have this point where the fans would turn up and wonder complain about the fact not enough was being spent on the club. And year upon year, Wenger, the star of the show, this charming man, would come and charm the pants off these fans, and just as soon as he arrived, almost on the stage, that was it. He covered so well for the owners of the time, and it was just this. It was almost the same story every time. Fans say, "Why aren't we spending money?" Oh, I'm trying to save this club, and it was almost like a self-sacrifice thing, and they never. But the thing is, there was a point, wasn't there, where belief started to fade in him, and you've got the part of the downfall, unfortunately, is the Arsenal fan TV years, the Claude, it's time to go, this awful situation where this great man is losing his powers, and all around him is being built up around him, and it was a case study in not going out at the right time in the end, because at the end of his time there, at the end of the club, it felt like the club built jobs around him, and he was surrounded by analysts and sporting directors, and when he'd run the club from top to bottom before that, and it was his exit was undignified in 2018, wasn't it? And despite the FA Cups and all the rest of it,
it was. I think this kind of stasis as well was allowed to develop around him and the team and what it was. And you mentioned those meetings, those were the AGMs, because Arsenal was one of the few clubs, might have been, that had them because they had shares listed on a stock exchange. So you have to have these meetings, and it's we see this quite a lot in football, particularly at institutional level, and you can argue Arsene Wenger's doing it now as well, providing cover for others through his personality. That I'll be the emblem, and I'll take some of that outrage in using my reputation. So I'm happy to launder your reputation through mine, and I find that a little bit sad. Unfortunately, that's why, particularly in some cases now, we'll get to it with FIFA and Infantino,
yes.
maybe. But in terms of, I was thinking about this in terms of his exit and those fallow years. They were toxic years. They were awful years, because the press box at the Emirates is quite low there, and it's near the bench, and those fans every week. If you sat there, first of all, it was spend some fucking money.
Yeah,
That was the thing for years, and then it was very personal and directed towards him. It was a very horrible environment, but equally, this is the man that brought you all of that glory. So it divided that fan base in a way that became very, very nasty. And you described like fan channels, and then we can get into what he also straddles pre and post social media age, doesn't he, Wenger? So you got all of this kind of nastiness and bitterness coming in, and his departure, it felt like there was a weakness of the people in charge. There was no more David Dean, his great friend, and people like that who were there. Peter Hillwood, all of these guys were kind of replaced by, I don't know, business CEO types. Arsenal became a different club, and it felt to me like no one had the balls to really take the decision on themselves. Whether it was Josh Kroenke, who now has become a bit of a personality at Arsenal, wasn't then. You had Ivan Gazidis, who was kind of there. Vinay came in after. It's like no one wanted to do what needed to be done, and this period of stasis happened. You described all of these things happening around him, and it led to that really pretty awkward and pretty lame departure for someone who's really rebuilt a new club. But like when he left in 2018, he did get the round of applause. It was emotional. But let me ask you, if he didn't go, what would the atmosphere in that stadium have been that day?
100%.
So on exactly that, I remember like it's in 2017. Oh, and I think that's quite a key year of Wenger. Obviously, it's his second last year, or leading up to his last. He wins the FA Cup, And I remember, and he wins the FA Cup for the third time in 4 years. I remember we were in the bottom, beside, just near the tunnel at Wembley, where the managers used to do their daily briefing. So they did their main press conference, and then they'd come out and talk to the kind of the newspaper writers for a few minutes. The mood was not one of celebration. He was obviously just talking about his future, and he was very kind of enigmatic about it. And at that point, is he going to walk? Like that's what he came out. I think obviously he hung on. I think one of the big issues with Wenger himself is it was almost, and I do wonder whether we're beginning to get into this with Pep Guardiola. And there's an argument actually that Fergie wasn't lucky because it is Fergie, but Fergie was going to go in 2012 and didn't because they lost the league to City, and then drives the team to win it through Van Persie. But obviously with Wenger, it always felt like he was waiting for that perfect goodbye. And at that point, it would have been another league title, which he's obsessed with, or a European trophy, which he thought he might get in 2018. And now when you look back, and it's why the FA Cup, which is like this is brilliant in his career. He's the most successful manager in the history of the oldest cup competition. The sort of record that really fits with someone who's so into the kind of rich tradition of football as Wenger. But you do wonder, looking back now, whether 2014, when he ended that 9-year trophy drought and they came back against Hull to win it, maybe that should have been the moment to walk away. But of course, he was just like a lot of them, especially like people who reach the levels of greatness he did. They just become, they always want that bit more.
So let's talk about Wenger post Arsenal, and there's a significant period of his life. Now, when Wenger was with Arsenal, he would talk about stuff like financial doping, the effects of state ownership, and let's just say that publicly, his opinions on these things appear to have changed. One fairly infamous interview or chat with Keys and Gray, and then obviously this job with Gianni Infantino. Now, my personal view is that Wenger is such a lover of football that he wants to do stuff for the good of the game, and these are the tools that he's dealt with, and he has to deal with Gianni Infantino because those are the people that are in charge. But it has, let's say, not say lessened his public image, but there's been some interesting things said by him over the years, hasn't there? Tariq.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's right. I think he's still a football obsessive. I think he really loves the game, and I think what we've seen, what he really loves, is developing young players into great players if he can, and finding them. We've talked about one of the things we didn't mention, I think, is worth talking about in terms of this, is that ability to see something others might not have seen in people, and given we talked about the confidence, but Thierry Henry, when he arrived, I think younger listeners might not be aware of the difficulties he had after he left France. He went from Monaco, where he was coached by Wenger, to Juventus, and he was stuck out on the wing over there, and he was having his career was not going to be the career possibly that it was to become, this great career. He comes to Arsenal, and in his words, Wenger retaught him everything he needed to know to be a striker, because he wasn't one, and he turned out to be one of the best in the world. So he loves developing and seeing players. So this role at FIFA, that he is probably, if he could draw the role, maybe he did say, I want to do this, is global talent identification. Wenger's view is there is talent in football everywhere in the world. It just needs to be found, and some places don't have the resources to be able to do this. And that is unfair on these young boys and girls who could have great careers, or really enjoy football, or be better than they are. And that I think is a really admirable kind of road to travel down, and a role to want to have. The problem comes when, in order to do your job, you are also being asked, because of your reputation and because of the respect that you have gained over the years, to then start advocating things that would seem the antithesis of everything that you believed when you were the coach. Why are you saying all of this? For example, Wenger was front and center of, a crackpot plan, as far as I'm concerned, maybe others would disagree, of playing the World Cup. The Men's World Cup is a wonderful football tournament. which played every 4 years, and that is also why the waiting is part of the journey here. And then we get this football tournament. Gianni Infantino, for reasons that are very hard to understand beyond maybe Saudi Arabia wanting the World Cup earlier and things like this, wanted to change this competition, which is going to be 100 years old in 2030, to one played every 2 years. And somehow he has Arsene Wenger as a handmaiden for this, at least a public push. And Wenger you wouldn't have thought be supporting something like this calendar crush. Then we have his comments around the heat at the Club World Cup, which were, if you ask some of the players, they felt it was dangerous. And you have Arsene Wenger advocating this, or covering for FIFA, and I think that's what sticks in the craw for a lot of people. Is this really Arsene Wenger?
A big one, actually, I remember as well was it the technical briefing towards the end of the 2022 World Cup, and obviously this is a World Cup, essentially that defined by a culture war that brought in all sorts of politics, and especially like say the German, like the armbands, the German players covering their mouths because they couldn't wear the armbands, about kind of the treatment of LGBTQ plus groups in Qatar. And Wenger had some very strange comments about how I'm paraphrasing here, but about how teams that avoided politics appeared to do better. It was sort of along those lines, which is, and this is a guy who like, one of the great things about him as a football figure was me and Barney, when we go to those Friday briefings, we joke, his phrase, we live in a world. That was his phrase. We live in a world where this is the world in which we live. But like, and suddenly he's kind of going, it feels to the other side of that. And then like you can get into, given all he spoke about, kind of, I suppose, and because he was the first to really talk about state, or the first in football to talk about kind of state ownership. And then obviously we, like, again, the total other side of that is FIFA's own burgeoning relationship with Saudi Arabia and other autocracies, and essentially kind of the way these states are becoming part of the infrastructure of the game. But I think there is something bigger here, and maybe this is where the sort of, again, the purist of Wenger had helped, because he believed in what football is and what football can do. I mean, one of his lines to me, and I don't think he said this in an Infantino way, was he thinks like football is a force for good, or it should be. He was talking about how kind of, maximizing young people to be able to play, to have that sense of self-expression. But there is a thing there of, especially in the post-Platini administration world, although Platini himself was an example of this, of football administration using true football people as almost kind of this sort of like to almost get this glow by association. Yeah, you can even see with Kalina there, with like to surround themselves with these football figures, because it's almost like they bestow an authenticity that a lot of these modern administrators don't necessarily have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the footballing afterlife of a manager, it's an interesting thing if you think about it. I mean, like, obviously, whenever you see Alex Ferguson these days, it's by racetrack. That's what he does. And he's had this, it's a long time now of just being seen there and occasionally featuring on documentaries about ex-players or people that he's worked with, but he's got his own life. Wenger's still working in the game. When you consider stuff people like, the classic managers, Matt Busby goes upstairs, Phil Shankly and Don Revie died quite young, and someone like Terry Venables had a fairly, business life that probably didn't work out for him after football. Johan Cruyff retired to Barcelona, but was still this almost, had this influence over both Ajax and Barcelona. From his newspaper column would dictate what would go on at both clubs and stuff like that. Wenger is a figure on that level, and I suppose his love of the game is reflected. He's 75 years old and he's still ploughing on, involved. But go.
But I wonder if there's something there, because there was always that. It's interesting you mentioned the Fergie and the racetracks there, because there was always that thing that Ferguson himself has admitted. He said it at the LMA Awards 2 years ago, where the racetrack was the one point where he could just, because he found himself so immersed, he felt it psychologically healthy for him, because it meant he wasn't thinking about football. And apparently Guardiola is actually the same with golf, that he immerses himself in golf. I know. Did Wenger ever have that? Because although I think he had a much wider hinterland than people often said, and like he's into films and all this, you would hear those stories though that he'd be sat at home and there'd be like 4 games going on.
Yeah. No, I think from an early age, and I think he's a football obsessive, but he was always going to be into this thing, because if you remember, he's talking about his childhood. He was an only child, and this was the thing that he was connected to, and football and Wenger are kind of inseparable. As I think that is him, and this move to FIFA kind of exemplifies this. This man wanting to stay relevant, wanting to stay connected. He's I think, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong here. The connection with Arsenal seems to have, because of this FIFA job mainly, and maybe because of the way of the exit, and because football may have moved on. He doesn't seem as, I don't know, as connected to Arsenal. He's still in football, but not connected to Arsenal in the way maybe you'd think he would be. But I just think his need to stay in football and to get this role has, just going back to this point of, has allowed him to swallow a lot of the nonsense at FIFA and just keep ploughing ahead.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, when Mikel Arteta has his struggles, and listen, Arsenal have been a very decent team, people don't have that Man United thing of like, let's go back to the Fergie days, do they? They don't do that with Arsenal. They don't say, let's go back to how Wenger did it. Isn't that interesting?
Is that because Arteta has transformed them though? I mean,
has he transformed them? That's the question.
He turned them from a basket case into one that's now challenging. Like they are a serious team now.
But maybe the point may arise when someone says maybe he needs to instill some Wenger style values, the way that we did with Ferguson.
That's a really good point, by the way. I think from Miguel, because Manchester United, if we're doing that comparison of those, that they have not got anywhere near any replace
Arsenal, certainly no.
But Arsenal are, there's a lot of criticism right now whether they're with a handbrake and lack of risk and all this, but they are in the conversation now for what's going to happen, and that's the focus. Maybe with Manchester United, the fact they really are nowhere near where they were. Until that happens, that connection and that kind of quest for being Fergie-like and someone like this to deliver something might be there. And then once someone is found, maybe that kind of slightly loosens the connection. Maybe.
It's funny the echoes, the way these things replay as well, because obviously one of the big debates at Arsenal in the last few years of Wenger, and just after, I suppose, was that we can't have the club, we can't make the mistake Manchester United made and have so much anchored to one man. And to be fair, they did start to try and change the structure before he left, and obviously they wanted a kind of classic sporting director manager structure. They have that now, but it's in a situation where Arteta isn't the head coach; he's the manager, and as obviously influential as Berta has been there, Arteta is basically the football side of the club is essentially all Arteta in the way it was with Wenger. He's obviously not got quite close to Wenger levels yet because he hasn't won a league or he's won the FA Cup. But we're waiting for that next major trophy. But maybe there isn't this kind of same philosophical transformation of the club, but it's still all geared up towards one football figure in the way it was. And well, let's see how that plays out.
Well, yes, let's see how that plays out. Let's see if Arsenal can ever be as great as they were in those Wenger years. I have my doubts, but we shall have to see. But I should say that I don't doubt that I should thank Tariq Panja. I should thank Miguel Delany. I should thank producer Tom, as always. Like, subscribe, review, get in touch with us on our email address. And most of all, thank you for listening on the 50th episode of Libero. Farewell.